Welcome, everybody. We are here for today's CV and Caffeine. We've got David Brosseau and Peter Chabris joining us from what I called the frigid north. And David just said it's like a warm, nice, lovely fall day in Canada with the temperatures that they're experiencing. So we're glad you're here. We're going to be about 30 minutes. Today, we are going to go over what we see leadership qualities somewhere in the CV process in somebody. Right? So let's talk about that possibly being in the KPA, right? What do we look for if we know we might want this person for leadership in the future, or we want that role to evolve in leadership in the future? And in the CV process itself, where can we actually spot that somebody's got leadership qualities, somebody has exhibited leadership in the past, and how do we dig deeper in that? And so that is going to be our topic today. We're taking a little bit of a spin on it, and we're going to dive into that aspect of it from leadership. Why this came about is, and we can actually thank David for that, is when we ask, hey, David, what's really prominent right now that we look at that we need to talk about? And he's like, leadership, leadership, leadership. We really have to look at leadership. We need to talk more about leadership. Perfect. So that's what we are here for today. So gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having.
Perfect.
Thank you.
So David, since you are the man of the hour and this topic was here because of you, talk to us about leadership, right? When we look at how do we find leadership in people, right? And how do we cultivate them? And what type of talent might that be? Tell us what you mean when you're like, we need more leadership. We need to talk about leadership. What does that even look like to you?
I think I said this because I think there's a lot of noise out there within the industry, and I think a leader's responsibility is to help quiet the noise and help focus on the things that need to be focused on, which 90% of the time is not the noise part. So that's where I come from, I guess, when I send that to you. How do you spot leadership? I think it starts with attitude, right? I mean, are people bringing you problems or solutions? Do people come to you and dump things on you to add to your plate, or they come to you with a solution and say, hey, I think I can do this. I'm just not sure. I need kind of to validate it or run it by you. These are people I want to hang out with and hope to develop into the next level they want to go. But I think we got away from being solution driven as a whole because of the way the market has shifted. I think we got a lot more scarce with our thought process. Like I need this, I need to keep this, I need to hang on to this, as opposed to say, all right, like how do we team up and maybe do better together, or how do we mastermind and develop this to another strategy or something more effective for both of us, instead of being paralyzed by the noise or what's happening out there. So I think the thought process of how someone shows up, I think somebody who's solution driven, and then from a KPA perspective, I think maybe assertiveness level, communication style, how they think. But I think ultimately for me, from the CV process, it comes down to their life story. I think that's where you can identify most of the leadership pattern, whether it's through school, through sports, through previous employers, from a family perspective, the ups, the downs, how they dealt with adversity. I always get excited if I can get someone to open up and I get to learn about their failures. And they're comfortable telling me about it. I'm like, oh, this is good. Like, I like that, So not so much the failure, but someone that is able to recognize that they've experienced it always speaks to a high level for me.
It's interesting. You said, with the last 2 years, it seems that we've kind of lost some focus on that, right? Well, we're not putting as much emphasis on solving the problems and leading and doing those things. We've gotten more tactical, right? When we look at the difference between wartime and peacetime, right? In our world of wartime and peacetime, the last 2 years have kind of been wartime in real estate, right? We've had lawsuits, we've had markets go down 35 to 40% in units. There's less bread on the table for everyone to eat. It's simply a more aggressive time, and it's simply more difficult to do work. And what that usually does is it ignites the fight or flight, right? And so what we look for is tactical, hustle, work, grind, put in the hours, have to do more. And we need that, and yet we only need that in short bursts to actually get to a point where we can then go back, lean back and say, okay, now I need to show up as a leader, or now I need leaders in here. And yes, we're going to work hard, and yes, we're going to shift tactically the way that we might do things, right? We will measure results and adjust activities, but it doesn't mean that we just grind for 2 or 3 years. And you're right. I've seen people that are just grinding the last 2 years instead of leading, instead of developing, instead of cultivating talent. They're just working, and they're just down to the knuckles on some of that stuff. And that's challenging, right? You can't do that
It's not
forever.
fun. It's
Business
tiring.
can't do that forever.
Right. I agree. It's not fun, and it's very tiring to operate that way, for sure.
Yeah, those should be sprints, not the marathon. Peter, what about you? What do you see in terms of, or what do you look for in the CV process if you know you might want a future leader, or how do you spot somebody that you didn't even know you might need as a leader in there?
Well, I mean, I think that the discovery begins early in the process. You know, the KPA is the real first big step of the CV process. And I think there's some markers. Assertiveness always, right? Anyone that is assertive is going to take initiative, and you can't have a leader that doesn't take initiative. That's not going to really work. But I think there's some modifying traits that I find really valuable. I love intensity. I definitely love a high level of intensity in leadership. The way I always sort of explain intensity when I'm teaching it to a class, it's like, who goes to sleep with the problem, right? And if you have a high level of intensity and you internalize the problem, when you have a high level of intensity, you internalize the problem, and it becomes part of the emotional fabric of your being. That to me is someone who's ready to take something head on, take responsibility for it, and run straight at the problem.
Peter, I feel like you just psychoanalyzed my bad sleep. Like, I wake up at 3 a.m. and I'm like, well, I need to do that. And what about that?
That's why you're a leader, Liz, is because it's part of your fabric. So I love high emotional intensity. I also want to make sure when I'm looking at leaders, when I think I've got a leader, I want to make sure that adaptability isn't rock bottom. Because if you have zero adaptability, remember, adaptability is desire to accommodate others. If there's no adaptability, a leader can, if they're not aware of their own behavioral styles, they can make decisions in a vacuum without really thinking through how it impacts the organization, and really more importantly, the people in the organization. And so if it's rock bottom adaptability, that's a red flag. It doesn't mean they can't be a leader, because I'm also going to look at the same time for, Gary will say the first step of leadership is self-leadership. And I think the first step of self-leadership is self-awareness. And when I'm doing a KPA, I'm looking for, in leadership roles, I want to see a high level of self-awareness where people can say, yes, that is me. And this is where I've overused that strength. And this is not just being aware of it, but also knowing how they offset their own weaknesses or their own overused strengths. That to me is someone that I don't have to coach them up on how to behave. They already understand, they already recognize their talents. They understand where they can be overused, and they understand how to hedge for that stuff, right?
It's interesting. I am super low on adaptability.
And so am I, right? This was
I'm like a one
skill for
right?
me,
Like
for sure.
I'm rock bottom. I'm also rock bottom on optimism. So for 2 of those modifying traits, like I'm rock bottom, which means I think everything's going to end poorly, right? I'm going to investigate why, how, everything. I'm going to look at the skeptical side of it, of what could go wrong, all those things. And I am rigid like I'm very rigid naturally from that adaptability standpoint, where if I decide it's one way, like I want it to be that way. And obviously that doesn't work long-term, as you just said. And over the years, that's an EQ, right? Your emotional intelligence and your self-awareness will say, yeah, I can't do that because here's where that will impact. And here's how that will be perceived, even if it's the right answer, by the way.
Right.
This is how it will be perceived by my team members who I didn't take into account how this might affect them, or I didn't acknowledge how this might affect them.
And I think,
love pointing out on the adaptability. I think that's one that people don't generally look at from that perspective of how does this play in a leadership role?
And all of those things. And the follow-up question is like, the KPA has those great questions. They're great for asking, but like, I think if you really want to get this thing, you got to understand, take it one step further. It's okay. Yes, the KPA is written so that you don't have to understand this stuff completely. You can just read the questions and make notes. But Liz, if it's a leadership role and they have low adaptability, I want to understand. I might ask a question like, tell me about a time where you had to check some of that a little bit when you were making a decision that impacted a group. Like, I want to see, self-awareness is one thing. I want to see how they've been able to alter their behavior to consider others when they're in that position of influence and decision-making. Because I think that matters. The other thing in the KPA that I'm looking for is if there are some, the more it is on this side or this side, the more acute and more committed they are to the behavior. Smart people are going to be able to operate outside of their natural behavioral style for a period of time. And if they have to operate out of that behavioral style for longer period of times, it creates more stress and burns them out faster. So a leader is going to have to behave outside their natural behavioral styles just because of the demands of leadership. One of the things I want to make sure in a leader, and I'm going to have a conversation in the KPA, is like, how do you recharge? How do you know when you need to recharge, and how do you do that? If they don't have explicit understanding of how they recharge when they're starting to flame out a little bit, that's a real red flag to me on their ability to lead on day one.
That's a huge one. And right, you said the self-awareness is the first step of self-leadership.
Right. Yep.
Are people aware that not only A, they will have to act outside of their natural behavior because that's what the role demands, and B, how long can they do it before they really need the recharge, and what's the recharge, right? Like that's a huge thing there.
Yeah.
What about thinking traits? Do either of you look at the thinking traits at a high level when you're looking at leadership roles?
I'll say yes and no, but I want to go back to a little bit what you guys just discussed about rigidity and flexibility, or being adaptable. I look at it more as not so much how they are, but how, I would say it this way, like how their score fits on what I need them to do.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's more, I feel like it's more my responsible to adapt to them if we have a different scale. As long as it's there at the level it needs to be to fulfill the role that they're in, then I need to be right with it, right? Like so eventually we can develop a working relationship that I may be able to influence it. But in the past, I would consider myself, I was probably relatively more black and white than I needed to be, and say, this is it. And I realized that now I literally do this towards the end. I'll draw a box, and I said, this is the non-negotiable, what's inside the box. I mean, this is how we're going to do it. Now you can implement it as you see fit. You can create your own ways of doing it and all this stuff, but this is what needs to be done. When you get outside the box, then this is how, then we need to have a chat. But as long as it gets done and we get where we need to go and we have forward movement and forward progress and all this stuff, I'm okay if you do it differently. I'm okay if you develop your own way. I'm okay with all of that. And I had to get right with it over time. But I think it also has changed my relationship with a lot of people, because now they get to own what they're going to build at a much higher level. I can give them parameters, I can give them guidelines, but I need to adapt that, and I need to be okay with, they may have a different path, but if we get to the same end game, then that's all that matters at the end of the day.
Well, and different people are going to get to things in a different manner for sure, right? Like, and by role, I'm not going to have the same personality style as director of operations. It's just not, right? That's not the roles that we're in, and that's not who we are. And yet we may end up at the same exact goal, right? How they get there and how I get there may look wildly different.
Yeah, right. I just think I need to adapt more than they do, I feel like, to me. Right. Like, and it's hard, because I always joke with people. I said, you only have to adapt to me. I have to adapt to you, right? So I think that's how I look at that particular trait, I guess. I think it's my job to find a way to connect and adapt with them, not the other way around.
What about the thinking traits? How do you guys look at the thinking traits when you're considering somebody for a leadership role? Is it high consideration for you? Is it low consideration for you? What do we look at for those?
I look for high vocabulary. Vocabulary isn't just testing recognition of words. It's the vocabulary test is really giving you an indication of their ability to pick up subtlety in meaning. And to me, a high vocabulary score is going to correspond with their ability to pick up nuance in communication. If leadership is influence, then influence is determined by your ability to communicate. And picking up nuance in the communication patterns of the people that you're leading is really important if you're going to have the ability to influence them and the ability to navigate interpersonal relationships, because leaders are succeeding with and through other people. So you've got to have a line of sight and be pretty intuitive on the non-spoken communication that's going on with the people that you work with.
Context. I always look at vocabulary as more of, like you're talking about, those subtle clues around. It's the context. What is the context? Exactly. It's not just the word. It's not just the thing you see. It's what's everything happening all around it. And that's where the vocabulary is super important. An important one for me is spatial visualization, right? If I'm going to work directly with somebody, I need them to have a high spatial visualization, simply because that's the way that I communicate and I solve problems. And what I have learned over years and years and years of working with people, it's very difficult for me to work with closely a leader in my organization that does not have high spatial visualization, right? It's simply the way that I operate. And if I have somebody with it low, we tend to have more conflict, right? Like we just tend to have conflict. And I don't look at it as a bad thing that somebody's is low, but what I know for me, working closely with somebody in a direct environment, that's a challenge for me to function that way. And for us to be as effective as possible, I also hire partially to me, not just the role.
Right. What about you, David? What do you look for?
I think when it comes down to thinking, I mean, obviously I second what you guys are saying, but I think I look for it more when I get to the life story. I try to get more into context of how they thought through, success times in their life, how they experience and thought through challenge time in their lives, how, like, I prefer understanding it through the lens of their life story than through the KPA itself or the definition itself. So the way I do the life story, I instead of how you feel about that, like what did you think of that experience, or what did you learn from that experience, or how did you think your way out of this, or how did you think your way through this, are questions I like to understand, because that forced them to tell me how they're thinking through it as opposed to how they feel to it. I think people have an easier time to tell us how they feel, and it gets them to pause a little bit more when I ask about how they're thinking about it.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I like to have context around it more than, from their perspective, more than the definitions that we get from the KPA itself, I guess.
Yeah, I think the biggest indicator of leadership potential is going to be in their track record of leadership, and that, of course, is in the life story. That's really where you're going to find your leader, I believe. To your point, David.
What if we have somebody that's got no job experience? What do we look for? And I'll tell you, this is a common question I get. They're like, this person's 20 years old, they're fresh out of college, they just graduated. This is their first real job, right? Anything past part-time, working at McDonald's. They're like, how do I know? What do I look for? How do I know? Because I'll tell you, a lot of people I find tend to write somebody off because they don't actually have large career experience. And so they immediately just kind of write it off. But I think that's a miss. What do you guys look for if you've got somebody who is greener, less experienced, or has been out of the job market for a while, in terms of potential for leadership in that life story? Not just the cold, hard, proven, I was a manager here, I moved to this position, this position, this position, this position, and then I became CEO. But what about the more subtle things? What do you look for in those subtle clues in the life story?
I think, to me, it's their, especially a young one, like at 21 or like 20, 21, like someone under 25, let's say, I want to understand their journey in terms of, did they go to school or not? Were they part of a fraternity, a sorority? Did they get into leadership with those things? What kind of leadership? How did they influence it? Did they have siblings? If so, how did they influence their siblings? How did they help or support or lead or whatever? Like, what's the relationship like, And I'm not looking, I'm not trying to determine whether it was good or bad. I'm just trying to find, like, were they in sports? Were they a leader in sports? Were they a captain? Were they a team captain? Were they, like, if they were in sports, what kind of what kind of GPA were they able to carry at the same time. Like if you play college sports and you have a full schedule at school, like it's hard. Like I have a daughter that is a junior playing soccer and gets 6 classes and practice twice a day. And I'm like, I don't know how you do it, but I'm telling you, when you're done, it's going to be a lot easier. So it's like when I look at this, like that's kind of how I'm trying to dig for experiences throughout their journey that they may or may not see as leadership, but when you come out of it and you look from the outside looking in, you're like, you know what, I was a great big sister or big brother or whatever. Like I was a great sibling, period. You don't have to be the older one. I was a great team captain. I was a great recruiter for my fraternity, whatever it is, But I think there's a lot to learn from how they position themselves throughout that time that I actually value some of those experience more than business experience.
Agree. What about you, Peter?
I think you're spot on. I mean, David, that's the right answer. There's no right answer. I think that's the best answer. If I could add anything to that, the only thing I would say is if they don't have a ton of leadership experience, I might want to flesh out a little bit what their relationship is with authority figures. Because if they have unhealthy relationships with authority figures, they're going to be abysmal leaders, right? And so I might test a little bit and talk about some of their relationships with authority figures in high school, in sports, with their coaches, right? Potentially with their bosses and their summer jobs. That would be the only additional thing I might be able to tease out of that conversation.
I'll tell you the one place I will look deeper in there as well with those contexts. Like I love people who played sports in college, high school, competitively, right? They're used to a team environment. They're used to rigorous activities. They understand discipline, forms good habits at a high level, right? Like that's just part of who they are. They get it. So they'll understand the things that we do. But one of the things, not everybody takes the leadership position, right? Not everyone's the team captain. Not everybody is the president of the board in school. And yet they can exhibit good quality leadership skills that I might be able to pull on. The other place I look is, and I like what you said, Peter, about how do they handle authority figures? When something goes wrong, what action did they take, right? Sure. In somebody's life story, we're going to hear good, bad, and ugly, right? We're going to hear about the boss that they felt held them back and didn't give them time or didn't provide the opportunity that they were promised. Okay, so how did you handle that? What did you do? How did you feel about your coworkers that were in that situation? Or if there was something major that happened, like let's go back to our COVID days, right? Like all of a sudden, boom, it's March 20th. You don't get to see your coworkers anymore. You're not going into the office. Everybody's stuck at home. Well, what did you do to help keep camaraderie in the business? Like, how did you stay engaged in things? How did we continue our learning, right? Like, I want to look forward just like what did they do? Did they bring other people into the fold to help other people? Did they react with self-leadership when the boss didn't do what they said they were going to do for them, right? Like, I get it. Everyone gets a bad boss every now and then in the real world. That happens. Like, we know because we've seen terrible leaders and terrible managers. It happens. But every boss isn't the bad boss, right? If you've had 6 jobs and 6 bad bosses, it's not the boss's problem. I'm going to dig really deep in how are you handling it? What are you doing? I love the life story. I think the life story gives us, I mean, it's gold. It's just an hour of gold, right? And 2 hours sometimes of gold, pure gold.
Yep.
At 25, it's 45 minutes sometimes. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, the younger you are, the quicker that can be. It's impressive what you uncover about people, though. I've worked with some people for years. One of our series that we do is something called My KW Story, where we do a 20-minute hyper intensive of a life story with give us the speed through your career and then KW, like what your world has been like since here. It is really fascinating to hear what some people's backgrounds are and where they come from and the nuances in it, like just those powerful things. And when we look at our powerful leaders, our strong leaders, the people who are shaping this company, our top teams, our top rainmakers, our top TLs, our top OPs, our top RDs, right? When we look at those people and we look at the story, success leaves clues. It may not always be in the form of a formalized leadership role, but success leaves clues. How did they handle difficult situations? How did they handle difficult personal things? How did they handle difficult business things? The life story is just pure gold, in my opinion. That paired with a KPA, you can definitely spot a winner. All right, we're
If
down
you
to the
don't,
last couple
you
of
go back.
minutes. Give me your last mic drop moment, your last key points you want to leave our viewers with today. David, we'll go with you.
I think we need to embrace leadership again. I think we got away from it for one reason or another, in my opinion, and we started listening to a lot of noise, and it got loud. And I think we have a lot of capable people out there, and we're a great company with a lot of good things. And I think we need to embrace leadership and develop it. I think it's one of the most valuable asset that a team or an organization can have, and I think we need to embrace it again.
All right, love it. Peter, last final words.
For identifying leadership in the career visioning process.
Yeah, just what you want to leave everybody with today. Last words of wisdoms.
I think if you're evaluating a leader for your organization, and you're going through the career visioning process, I think you have to take a step back during one of those red light, green light moments and just ask yourself, I have this part of my organization or my world that I'm thinking about entrusting in the hands of somebody else. Do I really believe that this person is going to take what I've created or what I'm responsible for and do something more with it? Because if they can't grow the thing, they're not the right leader. And I think you need to just check yourself before you're hired. Just because they look like a leader doesn't mean that they're the leader that can move the thing forward. Because I made that mistake too.
Well, here would be mine. If I was to give my last words of wisdom is plant the seeds of leadership earlier on. Some of you on this call and some of you watching this video might be a single agent with their first EA thinking, well, I don't really need to worry about this, right? I'm not 7th leveling anytime soon. It takes years to cultivate a top-notch leader and to find the right talent and to grow them into the person that they need to be and that you need them to be for your organization. For you to step up, you've got to be able to replace yourself with somebody qualified, right? So that happens every time we move our role. We give away the EA tasks. You need somebody who has self-leadership to do that. We give away the buyer agent side. You need somebody who's going to be able to do that. You give away your listing side. You give away your CEO role in the future. You 7th level, you retire, you step out of your market center, whatever it is. I'll tell you, one of the hugest things I see is that we're not planting those seeds of leadership early enough in people. And we're only having the conversation about leadership in the future when the role is now open. Talk about it years in advance.
That's gold.
Yeah,
Love
years. It. All right, gentlemen, I want to thank you for your time. Everybody who joined us today and is watching this video, thank you as well. David, Peter, stay warm. We will see everyone on next month's CV and Caffeine. Have a good one.
Bye, guys. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it, Liz.